Hello, Justin. Great to have you here.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's had a few technical issues to start, but it seems to be all okay now. Essentially, I just wanted to start off by asking you about your background as a well, in bands, in music, a little bit as in performance, and yeah, I guess that's how we could start, and then we could maybe move a bit more to the politics side after.
Yeah, I mean, I got into bands really the same way and the same reason that most people do. I was attracted to a certain idea of a kind of hedonistic lifestyle. I was seduced by the pull of stardom, uh, even though I would never have admitted it. Uh, and I liked having fun with my friends, and music was always, for me, quite a natural and easy way to express myself. Um, uh, it's kind of like doing shows is kind of like being drunk without actually drinking. For some reason, I can completely lose all sense of inhibitions. And it's quite a euphoric feeling most of the time. Sometimes it's terrible.
Okay. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think probably if I was to go back to when I was in a band uh, at school, that probably would have been my draw. I mean, the draw of it would have been sort of the hedonistic aspect of it, and yeah, it's interesting you saying that about performing and going out, and it's a bit like not necessarily not having to drink, but to kind of really get into a kind of a state of something without necessarily relying on substances or something like that. There's definitely an element of that I
Yeah, I
can
mean,
I
actually,
can connect with.
if you'd asked me in my early 20s why, I want to be in a band, I would have probably given you some kind of bullshit ego-driven answer like I want to do something socially and culturally important or you know but I think that's just a kind of bubble that uh people like me can all too easily fall into where you sort of uh think that you're the center of the universe and yeah, I think in hindsight the the best takeaways from doing music is just really the connections that I was able to make with people, both inside and outside of the band.
I see. So is this, I mean, is this something, being in a band and being in a kind of a group of people making music, is that something that really appeals to you about music making?
Um, yeah, uh, I like as I said, the kind of creative and uh, collaborative process of making a record, writing and recording. Um, I suppose, yeah, I'm most in my element on stage. I always have felt that I'm more of a performer than you know, than an artist in that sense, or a musician, really. Uh, I guess that's why I chose to be a frontman, so I didn't have to uh, carry any gear anywhere.
Yes, I can remember the bassist in my old band saying, "You just like not carrying gear, basically, is the reason you're the front man." Uh,
I occasionally chipped in. I occasionally chipped in.
but yeah, okay, interesting. And is that something in terms of your overall attention and focus, is this something that you say has has changed over time, like your because of your interest in sort of media and the political aspects of media? Is that something that has reduced in your level of attention over the years, would you say?
No, I mean, I was interested in media actually, sort of issues to do with media power and propaganda even before I joined a band. Um, and it's always kind of been there. And I think it's probably um, been expressed in some way uh, through the songwriting and the performing, and also some of the kind of bits of activism that I got involved in and around the band. Um, Having said that, uh, I've never sought to either kind of impose a uh, political stripe or agenda on the band, and don't actually particularly feel comfortable with doing that either. I mean, I'm always kind of sensitive to that sort of difficult balance to strike, really, when you have any sort of platform. Um, and it wasn't by any means a huge platform, but we did have at one point at least a pretty decent sized club or theatre level audience in certainly in the UK and in some places in Europe. I've always been a little bit uncomfortable about using that platform uh, just for pure political expression, or in some way trying to kind of artificially uh, distort the creative process by imposing, as I say, a kind of political agenda on it. I see in that sense my politics and music as two quite different things, and I think more and more, in fact, nowadays music is almost a sort of cathartic escape from politics.
Interesting. Uh, yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, I can thinking back to the time, well, thinking back to the sort of early 2000s and the kind of music scene that Hell for Heroes, etc., and those kind of bands kind of came out of. It kind of reminds me of. I mean, there wasn't. I guess there wasn't so much a kind of, well, not that I can remember. There wasn't really a specific political kind of thing behind a lot of the bands at that time. I mean, obviously there were people who were quite into things like sort of specific lifestyles and things like that at that time. I remember a lot of people being very into things like being straight edge. Do you remember?
Yeah,
Yeah, the sort of post-hardcore kind
yeah,
of thing of that. But there wasn't really an explicit political project behind anything that I can think of.
yeah. I mean, I guess it was like political with a small p, really. It was a it was a kind of way of uh, expressing yourself, and I suppose a way of looking at the world, um, that I think had something to do with uh, confronting power, in some way, or resisting power, which I think to me is in some ways the kind of definition of politics. But you're right, it wasn't it wasn't like a socialist movement or an anarchist movement, really. And yeah, I think probably for good reason, um, on balance.
Yeah, yeah. It's yeah, it's an interesting point. It doesn't have the same kind of at least in the UK that I can think of sort of background as something like post-punk or something where you've got this, I guess, a kind of a more explicit on the nose political kind of edge to it, I suppose. Um anyway, at least least as I can remember. Um
Yeah, I mean it's hard to tell, isn't it? Because thinking of like bands back in the old days, take a band like The Clash. I mean, um, they were quite explicitly political, but well, I mean, not in a way that you could easily sort of tie to a political party or even a political ideology. Uh, it was a kind of fuck you politics,
Yeah.
uh, which I think it goes all the way back to rock and roll. I mean, that's just uh, endemic in a lot of popular music and a lot of it's always been, in my view, in kind of hip hop, grime music, uh, punk, uh, even some kind of genres of dance music. And I think it's always, in some ways, more powerful when it's not made explicit, when it is, kind of expressed sort of naturally through the music or the performance. Um, I find, to be honest with you, the kind of pontificating of some frontmen in particular. I know I won't name names, but I'm sure they're pretty obvious. I personally, I find that a bit of a turn off. Um, I mean, I was always a massive Pink Floyd fan, uh, but and I actually agree with most of Roger Waters' politics. But when he stood up in front of the UN, whatever it was last year, and basically claimed to be speaking on behalf of the citizens of the world, I was just like, I'm not even sure you speak on behalf of Pink Floyd, let alone the entire global population. But yeah, sometimes I think it is a bit, it's a little too much.
Hmm. Yeah. No, I can understand. So yeah, I mean it's interesting because I guess you've got different elements floating around there, the sort of respective egos of people in bands, and their sort of wish perhaps to kind of to stand up and make a strong point about something, which in the Roger Waters example that you gave, maybe is done rather in a rather over the top way. Um, but I mean, is there in terms of the overall political shape of music, have you sort of seen any changes, would you say, in the last, I would say, well, I guess the last sort of 10, 15 years in terms of music being more political or less political, or in terms of the sort of groups that you play with, perhaps, even if not, personally, when it comes to
Uh,
music?
I think you have to take a little bit more of a longer view than that. I mean, I think popular music has become depoliticized, um, and I think that's a bad thing. Uh, and by that I mean, you know, um, if you look at the late 70s Britain, and you had slogans like, God save the Queen, the fascist regime, and we don't need no education, we don't need no thought control, and war is over if you want it. These were like slogans that were being beamed into millions of households. Um, and that just doesn't happen anymore. It's not to say that there aren't uh, bands and musicians uh, who are in similar ways expressing some kind of uh, cultural resistance or political resistance in their music, but it just doesn't have that transcendent impact. And that's, I think, all to do with the way we've become just much more isolated and atomized, and music's become less of a kind of community centered experience. I think obviously digital media technologies have a lot to do with that, but I think there's other things in the mix as well. So yeah, in that sense, um, it's not a particularly effective medium. Having said that, when Dave went on the Brit Awards, I think this was in maybe about 2 or 3 years ago, um, and he did that song Black, I think it's called. Um, and he added a verse calling then Prime Minister Boris Johnson a liar and a racist. I mean, that was I really I had kind of hair standing on the back of my neck when I watched that. I thought that was incredibly brave and powerful and really kind of effectively done. As I say, it wasn't um, somehow it didn't feel like it was somehow imposed on the music. It kind of uh, was embedded in it in a very what felt like a sort of very natural and creative way. Um, so there is exceptions to the rule, but generally not a whole lot of that stuff around these days.
Yeah. I mean, do you think perhaps the sort of, well, you were talking about the sort of well, I guess consumption of music we could look at in that way in terms of um the sort of music that we just we just go on to Spotify or Apple Music or something like that, and we just listen to whatever. We might not necessarily listen to a specific album and sit down and listen to consume an album in the way that we might have done in the past, and sort of more general social kind of experiences with music, closure of venues, things like that as well. Um, I mean, do you think perhaps that this sounds a bit kind of a bit of a kind of a Marxisty kind of perspective to have to sort of take, but perhaps the kind of social economic conditions of music in some way have or music production have shifted that has perhaps affected the culture in some way?
I think that's part of it. I think the truth is most people who listen to rock music, for example, these days aren't quite as socially and economically marginalized as perhaps they might have been, 20, 30, 50 years ago. I think, as I said, digital media technologies are definitely a major piece of the puzzle. The way, as you said, we consume music often in a kind of vacuum, like you just very sort of personalized or on demand selections on your whatever streaming app you use. It's not quite the same collective music listening experience that you used to get even just tuning into a radio station. So even like if you're on your own, you're tuning into a radio station and a song you really like comes on, you have some, I think, sense of a communal listening experience. You have sense that there are other people listening and enjoying that song with you right in real time. Um, so that's definitely a factor. But a major factor for me is the decline of kind of local music scene. I mean, if you think about really all of the great rock and roll movements, they all came out of usually like city-based scenes, Manchester indie scene, obviously Seattle grunge, the London punk scene, West London punk scene more than anything else. And even, probably the most recent example of that is, the way kind of grime emerged as a very locally defined genre in, nightclubs around Bow and other parts of East London. Um, but it just doesn't happen anymore. I'm not entirely sure why. But it obviously has something to do with our listening habits, but also something to do with the way that we kind of socialize and convene, really, or don't
Yeah,
as much.
yeah, and it's an interesting point. Um, I mean, there doesn't seem to be that scene element so much now. I mean, I remember obviously in the past, as growing up as a teenager and young adult, being involved. Well, I mean, where I'm from in Kent, along the sort of south coast, there was a bit of a scene in terms of bands from that area and bands coming down from London and from Sussex playing in around there, and definitely a kind of a there was a scene which was really cool at the time, and I something that um was good because you'd see other bands and you'd kind of get in a sense of what was happening, what people kind of music, how music was developing, and make connections as well for gigs that you then go on to do later, or performances.
Yeah.
There's also, I mean, another thing I suppose that's probably related to this on some level, but perhaps I'm not sure if it's such a sort of so starkly affected by sort of maybe socio-economic factors. I don't know, but this kind of idea of sort of identity behind music, like someone saying, from a particular subgenre, saying, well, I am a punk, or I am I'm a post-hardcore kid, or I'm a this, I'm a that, or, I mean, do you think this is something that's also sort of disappeared? It seems to be. I mean, I might be wrong on that, but I don't know.
Yeah, maybe to some extent that's that goes along with the decline of scenes really. Because with sort of genre defined scenes you usually get particular ways of uh you know dressing and talking, and that element I don't miss so much, to be honest with you. Think it can be quite a sort of creatively repressive when you have kind of codes that develop around particular music genres about what you're supposed to look like, and indeed what kind of music you're supposed to create. I mean, the sort of classic example of this is the infamous, which is now the subject of a movie, when Bob Dylan went electric. And yeah, so I that thing I don't think is such a bad thing. I mean, it's always a kind of paradox, isn't it? Because, or a conflict, because you want to have that sense of uh belonging, and yeah, I guess group identity with music, because it just makes for a more somehow intense and collective experience. Um, but on the other hand, it can be quite uh, sort of disabling in some ways.
Yeah, I mean that. Yes, that's the risk of a clique, I guess, in that way,
Yeah.
with a very much of coded kind of experience, and then people who are in or out of a specific group in that way. Um, yeah, it's difficult on some level because you kind of see how that kind of, well, at least I can kind of see how that kind of sort of slightly esoteric element of it is some can be good for producing something, but then obviously it can also be restrictive and then limit people in terms of not create a very nice atmosphere for people who want to kind of come into that, or create codes that people don't understand. So it's an interesting one. Um, yeah, I suppose. I mean, do you see? I mean, this is sort of thinking more about sort of into the future, and I don't know how well necessarily you'd be able to answer this, but do you think that there's a chance that this could change? We could go back to a more kind of uh public, or kind of more scene-esque kind of music environment? Do you think would there be would something need to change for that to happen, or
I mean, I think we probably,
are we past it?
I mean, I think I don't know whether this was pre-recording or post-recording, but I definitely caveated everything I say with you know, I know nothing really about music, and particularly contemporary uh popular music. I imagine that there may well be quite localized music scenes. Just as I imagine there is music that is uh in some ways even rock music that it is in some ways a kind of I don't know, anti uh authoritarian in that kind of tradition, certainly of punk rock. The issue for me is they don't have really any traction. So we live in this very weird world now musically, where you know you can get a even like a top five album and be selling out Brixton Academy or whatever, uh, you know, 5,000 capacity venues, and literally almost everyone who's not at that concert has probably never heard of you. And that never used to be the case, right? We used to basically, and in some ways that's for the good. We used to have much more of a kind of an all or nothing music scene. And now you've got like a lot of kind of jobbing bands, who have, fairly established audiences, sometimes from different parts of the world, and they make a decent living. Um, and that's a good thing, but it means that you don't get that kind of traction. You don't get that impact. Like I said, when uh, Sex Pistols had a hit record, or The Clash had a hit record, it was like millions and millions of households got exposed to it, whether that's through Top of the Pops or other kind of daytime TV shows that had that reach. And yeah, that we have nothing like these days, as far as I can see. I mean, maybe like bands like, I guess, the Arctic Monkeys come sort of closest to that sort of, yeah, that kind of alternative uh music reaching a kind of mass audience, but it's a borderline case, and it's definitely the exception.
Yeah, yeah. And in terms of the music press, and I suppose, I mean, I remember reading stuff about, well, about your band Heads for Heroes, like in Rock Sound magazine, and I think the first time I ever heard you was on a demo, I think that they did, and that's probably how we got. I think that's probably how I got introduced to your music. Um, do you think that the music press has had to accommodate or shift in a way because of this change? I mean, I suppose, yeah. I mean, I imagine it would have to, but
Yeah, that's something that I'm completely out of the loop on. Do people still read those kind of magazines? I mean, I guess that they're only online now, right? Uh, I don't know. Maybe. But my instinct is they don't have uh the kind of the influence that they used to. I think nowadays it seems to be all about Spotify playlists, um, which is in a way a slightly kind of soulless and mechanical way of connecting music with audiences, particularly the ones, the kind of auto curated playlists, but even the ones that are kind of handmade, as it were. It's not like a radio station where you can have at least the sort of maybe a kind of personality that goes along with it or in between or introduces the music. Uh, so yeah, I wonder if there's something kind of missing there as well. But you know, it's always tempting, particularly uh, for an old man like me, to sort of lament about how much better things were, back in whenever. Truth is, I don't actually think as much has changed as we probably assume. Um, it's always been a racket, the getting a playlist on a radio station was always about, more than anything else, a bit of payola and some very well massaged uh industry relationships between record companies, pluggers, and DJs. And nowadays, I guess it's, probably more to do with, I don't know, bot farms, or, trying to kind of artificially inflate streaming numbers. That's always been the way. I mean, the music industry has always been something of a black market,
Yeah. I
and always
mean,
will be.
I guess so. It's always, yeah, I suppose, just the kind of the nature of it, I suppose, and um, the, I mean, playing concerts and not getting paid very well for them, and those kind of things were always present. I mean, I remember, yeah, in the past, I suppose yeah, I mean, the music industry's always had that kind of element to it. But yeah, I suppose, I mean, uh, in terms of how things might change in the future, it would. I mean, I can't really see how necessarily how they would change, but I guess the point you made about, well, about perhaps our perspective is wrong, and perhaps it just looks a lot different when actually it's always the same as it's been, or it's kind of similar to how it always was anyway. The music industry, and perhaps in terms of the scene thing, perhaps, yeah, perhaps we are just old farts and we don't know, like, we don't know what's out there, and we don't know what kind of music is there, and we're just not exposed to it, and it doesn't get the traction for whatever reason.
Yeah, I mean, I do think actually, uh, I know like musicians love to complain, as academics and everyone does really. But um, the truth is, uh, if you are selling out those kind of venues, provided you don't rely on some massive uh, production, um, and you can sell them out reasonably regularly, and perhaps in like more than one country, you can make a decent living out of music, and um, not have to deal with, I guess, the trappings of sort of mega fame, and you can have a pretty fun, interesting life, which, as I say, wasn't really possible. Um, when we were doing the band full time, it was like, I mean, we did manage to, I guess, scrape along, doing mostly club tours over the best part of a decade. Uh, but I think nowadays, you get a better, most bands are getting better deals in terms of uh, fees than they were. I mean, at least we seem to be getting, several times the fee that we were paid to do the same venues, 20 years ago.
Hmm.
And it's not because we're, selling more tickets. It seems that something has changed there. Um, and yeah, I think if you can make it work, then there are probably in some ways more opportunities. There's definitely more opportunities, obviously, to kind of connect with audiences. I do find the whole, kind of endless stream of social media content that fans put out, pretty boring. But again, maybe that's just my age.
Yeah. I mean, is this kind of, I mean, is the relation is the labor relation different, or relationship different in that way with bands, and I mean them having to produce a kind of story for themselves constantly on social media, perhaps? Do you think I mean, that seems to me something that perhaps is quite different from the past. I mean, obviously, I mean, I think well, years ago, I remember we had a sort of a blog or something that we used to write, like, for concerts, and it was just like, we played a gig here and we did this and da da da, and that was that, and it was just, we'd maybe write a review of a show that we did, but then there wasn't this constant need to sort of present ourselves again and again.
Yeah, I don't buy it.
No.
And do you know what? Uh, I know this is going against every kind of received wisdom of, marketing professionals and record companies and everything else. But I just think, I think it's bullshit. I don't think you need to have this constant stream of, oh, here we are in the dressing room and here I am in the toilet. And, it's like, uh, less is more, man. Like, I mean, just, um, I would just steer well clear of that. I steer well clear of that. And also the other thing is, I kind of discovered recently, uh, the algorithms are, triggered actually. Like if you have got an established following, um, if you post, obviously, if you post kind of, the more frequently you post, um, the less engagement you're going to get per post because the algorithm is going to look at it as like nothing particularly new or exciting. But if
Hmm.
you do like, as we tend to do, like one post in a blue moon, uh, then it kind of it really travels.
Okay.
And I just don't buy it. I don't buy the logic of it. Um I don't I don't I don't like the aesthetic of it. Uh and I think it sounds to me like one of those things that people just assume is the case because of the group thing, because everyone says, oh yeah, you've got to keep posting content, you've got to keep posting content, you've got to keep posting content. I'm just not sure. I'm not even sure you have to. Yeah, like when we were around, everyone said, oh, you've got to keep touring, you've got to keep touring. I'm just not even sure that's the case. Like tour less and make it more of a story. Um, say less and make it more important when you do say it.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
my advice for what it's worth.
Uh,
But like literally, no one should take my advice because I'm in a very unfamous and unsuccessful rock band. So please ignore me.
Do you get I mean, do you get a lot of well, do you get people to shows that are kind of new to your music, or is it kind of aging sort of millennials like sort of me who are kind of a bit like who would be there like oh, or is it much younger people coming along or
It's a beautiful mix actually.
hmm,
Yeah, surprising mix, like a pretty even spread, I would say, from kind of younger people through to people our age and above. Um, at least that's the last few kind of headline shows that we've done. That seems to have been the case. We don't really conduct uh, audience surveys, but yeah, and I often get messages from people, saying, "Oh, I only recently discovered all your music or going to music," and that's quite a nice thing, obviously, because it means, I guess that the records have some degree of shelf life. Um, and yeah, we are kind of doing some new stuff along the way as well. So yeah.
nice. What album, which album would you kind of say was your well, I don't know if I necessarily was your favorite, but which album would you say, okay, you guys, you should listen to this. This is where we're at, or this is the one I want to show you.
Well, definitely the last album.
Hmm?
Definitely the last album we recorded, um, which was just called Hell is for Heroes, and it was, I think my favorite by some measure. Um, and I mean, it was actually by far and away our most successful album in terms of uh, how much we spent on it versus uh, your kind of your sales return. But it didn't have anywhere near the reach that our first album had because that was on EMI in the sort of dying days of the rock music industry, where major labels were still taking a punt on whoever they thought might be the next Nirvana and spending obscene amounts of money on uh, bands like us that should never have seen that kind of um, that kind of support, if you like. But yeah, so that's kind of, I mean, that first record is what really, I guess, established our fan base. But it's the third album that I think kind of musically we found our feet.
Yeah, yeah. It's a nice one. You got the Arcades. That's one. That's quite a nice song on
Yeah,
there. There's a lot. Well, there are lots of nice songs on there, but I like that one a lot.
yeah. I mean, it was a bit. I think for me also, it was kind of a bit less sort of teenage angst and more kind of mournful and climactic
Hmm.
than our previous records. Um,
Yeah, yeah. Nice. Okay. Well, I think we could probably finish off there on a sort of more music rather than sort of politics kind of based ending. But thanks very much,
all right,
Justin. It's great to talk to you. Really interesting.
pleasure.
Um, and oh yeah, is there anything you want to sort of mention or plug or anything while you're here? Nothing you particularly want to?
Nah, nothing at all.
No. Not going to be doing a social media post from from a
Ah,
toilet somewhere later.
I mean, if anyone really wants to listen to, any of our records or read any of my uh books or rants, I'm sure they can find it on their own.
They can find it. Cool. All right. Excellent. Thank you very much. And
Cool, man.
yeah, it's been been great talking.
Nice one. Thanks a lot.